Hey everybody, this is Minion Soldier and this is the Piracy Show. Now, for today's show, we are of course dealing with the Sabre. And I have gone out over the weekend and I have basically used up all my rec and then gone out and earned some more to go and test just about every single weapon system that I could think of to put on the ship to see how viable it was, to see how comfortable it was using it, and to give you my opinion on all of them. I have also collected data on the thermal emissions of the weapons and how they relate to the ship, or rather how the ship's thermal emissions are using the weapons, their EM emissions, so you can take that with your low observability craft, and you can basically make a judgment call based on how you want to use it, how you want to fly it. You'll have all the information you need just from typical tests to kind of go ahead and make an informed choice. I'm going to give you my thoughts on the matter, and we're going to, well, frankly, we've got a lot of weapon systems to get through, so I think at this point, let's just get started. Now, first off, we're using size 3 Panthers. Now, you get 2 size 3 Panthers with the ship initially, and then you have 2 size 2 Badgers to go along with it. Now, the size 3 Panthers generally are pretty darn good. They are a reliable weapon system, and you know what? They get the damage done, and they have the added bonus of there's just such a huge rate of fire coming out of them that they can be very devastating, even though the initial hits may not be that much. Now, I'm also including the thermal and EM data, as you can see over here, so that you have a better reference point. Now, these are roughly from about the same time frames, but not exactly. But this gives you an idea of the typical EM emissions and thermal emissions of the ship while operating these weapons. Now, they were overall very efficient. I mean, just the ability, when you're using fixed weapons, your accuracy is not going to be the greatest because it's dependent also on the maneuverability of your ship. And insofar as how these weapons performed in combat, I enjoyed them very, very much. Now, what I did to kind of give an idea of how these tests go is I tried basically the first 3, squadrons in Vanduul Swarm. How quickly can I decimate the first 3 squadrons in Vanduul Swarm with each set of weapons? So I kind of took them out and just wrung them all out. Panthers were first, and they were awesome. I mean, for a fixed weapon, they have that rate of fire which allows you to kind of kill things even though your accuracy is not the best. And so, I mean, it just allowed me to just pulverize my opponents with just a rain of fire. Now, they weren't always the most comfortable to use, and I mean, some of that is obviously getting used to it. But another thing to note is that, energy weapons generally have a very high travel rate on their projectiles, so you don't have to worry too much about the little pipper being drawn too far off to the side of the screen even during high-speed maneuvers. So overall, the Panthers, I mean, their thermal emissions, they didn't add that much to the thermal emissions of the ship. EM emissions weren't like overly terrible. So overall, I found the Panthers to be a very efficient weapon to use, and genuinely, I enjoyed them. Now, of course, Panthers are expensive, and, that's something to think about as well. And, I mean, if you want to go out and earn the rec for them, they can be a little bit pricey. And especially if you're going to take them into PvP, you may notice that, obviously Vanduul Swarm is one thing, PvP is entirely another. And ships take considerably longer to kill sometimes in PvP. And the Panthers being fixed do make that a little bit difficult at times. It depends on how quickly your enemies, cooperate with you. But here we are, we're 3 minutes 30 seconds in, and we're already on the final group. And we're working on Little King here. And overall, I mean, they just did very well. You know, they weren't anything to really write home about, but they got the job done, and they got the job done well. Now, another weapon system that I wanted to test, however, unfortunately, it's not in the stores, and the only, I only had 2 of them really, was the M5A lasers, which are the size 3s. I wanted to try those out as well, but unfortunately, there's only 2 right now that I have, which are on my Xeon Scout, and for some reason, they're not in the store yet, so I wasn't able to basically test those weapons. But overall, like, the Panther, even against like a much larger target, just the overall saturation effect of the fire and the fact that these weapons generally take a lot of effort to overheat, it just kind of led me to think, you know what, the Panthers are just a solid choice. I really think that you just can't go wrong with the Panthers. So here we are. I think this is the last guy here. Closing in on him. That's it. 4 minutes, 58 seconds. Not too bad. So let's move on and test the next set of weapons. Next up, we got the Gallants in Arms Mantis GT220s. Now, these guns were not my favorites. In fact, quite far from it. Now, projectiles themselves are problematic because of lead issues and generally the slower travel time of the projectile, but these ones felt exceptionally uncooperative and I did not enjoy them at all. Now, add to that the fact that generally once you really let them rip, the thermals kind of go through the roof. I mean, typically the thermals on this ship would sit around 180 to 114 in normal operating range with the initial weapons that you get with it. But when these weapons overheat, this thing can go over 400 thermals. Though the EM really doesn't shift that much, the thermals itself make it more or less bigger than a Super Hornet in terms of like IR missile tracking. So I mean, I guess there's something to be said. I mean, if you were attacking a larger target, something like say the size of a Freelancer, or maybe something the size of a Vanguard. But overall, it's just the lag in weapon activation and I don't know, it's just the bullets just never seem to want to go anywhere. I mean, they're just kind of like lazily leaving the barrel, and it was perhaps one of the most awkward weapons, if not the second most awkward weapon that I used. All said and done, I did not enjoy them at all. I found that my rec could have been spent elsewhere. This was one of the weapon systems that as soon as I started using it, I was like, well, there goes a big chunk of rec that I'm never going to see again. And it did feel thoroughly wasted. I mean, limited ammunition capacity aside, just like one of the things about Gatling guns is the reason why they have 6 barrels rotating is so that they don't overheat. But these things just overheat like crazy. I mean, it feels like they're a little too much in that area. And I mean, for a weapon that's designed for saturation of fire, they really can't sustain fire for very long. So I would say that these things are factory defective, or they need to be returned because they're just broken. They obviously need to be revisited because they overheat way too easily, and given the limited amount of ammo that they have, I was not impressed with them. I was really just having to work too hard for kills in friggin' the first 3 stages of Vandal Swarm. Way too hard. I mean, there were weapon systems that were much better than this. I mean, night and day. Now, this wasn't the weapon system that I hated the most, but it was a close second. It really, really was. But we'll get to that weapon system in a little while. Now, overall, I was able to kind of get through enemies efficiently. Well, not as efficiently as I would like, because obviously, typically, I would already be at the final stage by now. But I'm not. I'm still working on second stage. I guess, something could be said for, having to get used to it and get more practice with it. But this weapon system was just, it's so terrible that I don't even want to practice with it, because I already know, having tested so many this weekend, that there is way, way better for your wreck out there. These things were just, they're overheating again. And again. I mean, maybe if they didn't have that overheat issue, which is somewhat hilarious, they wouldn't be as terrible. But even then, when you look at like the amount of ammo that you have to go through to get anything done with these guns, it's just, they just don't make sense. They really, really need another balance pass, because I mean, these weapons are a hindrance to your gameplay, and they're a hindrance to your enjoyment of the game. And I mean, that's my honest point of view on these guns, is that they are just tragically balanced. They really just don't have a place in the game whatsoever as it stands. I don't know, possibly assaulting a larger ship that's, goodly enough to stand still and then not take advantage of the fact that you have a huge thermal signature while you're using them, because they overheat so often. I mean, you're never going to be able to spill out all your ammo using these. I mean, they're just going to overheat every time. And I mean, you can see by that footage, I mean, it was just, enough's enough. These guns aren't going anywhere. Big disappointments, and there's a lot better you can get for your wreck or for your money in the game. So let's move on to something a little bit better. Next up, we got the Gatlings Tarantula GT870 Mark IIIs. Now, these guns were a little bit better. Not by much, but they were a little bit better. Now, overall, the slow rate of fire on these projectiles kind of tell me that this would probably be better at assaulting a larger, slower moving vessel than a smaller one. Now, the EM and thermal signature of the ship while you were using these weapons was very, very low. I would say one of the lowest out of them all, and it was, it just wasn't very noticeable. And so I think that, once again, if you're attacking a larger ship and you're trying to avoid getting shot by the gunners, or trying to avoid being spotted or tracked by missiles, that these would probably be the best guns to use, because once again, they do just punch straight through shields and they do get epic kills. Now, against fighters, obviously not so much. They're much more difficult to target. They're unreliable against fast-moving targets. It's not to say that you can't get some spectacular kills with them. It's just, they're not the most reliable. And once again, it's that projectile travel rate. But unlike the previous guns, I actually did like these. Now, obviously not for fighter work, but I don't know. Honestly, I could see, a ship like this, like the Sabre, once we can really drive those SIGs down, and once we can really kind of mess around with our signatures, if we do get that kind of liberty, I could see, Sabres equipped like this being very serious threats to larger vessels, because you would be able to do a large amount of damage from a long range, and possibly, it would really help out with piracy obviously, but I mean, not just that, but assaults on larger vessels, supporting assaults on larger ships. I mean, the list goes on, and like the things that you can do to larger vessels with these things. And I mean, obviously, a lot of that has yet to be explored, but I really, really like these weapons. Obviously, not for fighter versus fighter, but for fighter versus much larger vessel, I think there's strong potential with these weapons, even though they did struggle in my little test here. They just, I mean, obviously, with more practice, things could have been better, but overall, you know what? Even though this test doesn't really show it, I think that they are solid weapons. And, you know, with projectile weapons, obviously, you do have to pay for projectiles. You do have to buy them. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to manufacture them at some point and save ourselves the money, you know, or really we would be spending time instead of money. But either way, that also has to be taken into account too. And I can't see the projectiles on something like this being cheap. So possibly an energy weapon that somewhat fulfills the same role of a high alpha but a low travel time on the projectile might be good, but overall I think there's a lot of potential with these things. Clearly not in fighter combat though. I can tell you that, you know, when I was trying to get these kills, I was just, you know, I was swearing. That's the reason why my mic isn't on during the combat tests. Now, there is one test where I'm glad that my mic wasn't on, but it isn't this one. This one, though frustrating, I mean, here we are. We're pretty much on the final wave now, are we? Yeah. And, you know, even though these weapons aren't the most cooperative, you know, we're still able to make some decent headway, unlike the GT220. So, possibly with a lot of practice for anti-fighter work, these could be interesting, but you'd really want to put in the effort. And, you know, for PvP though, you know, human beings tend to be a little bit more intelligent than AI and tend to fly a little bit better, or at least a little bit more erratically. And the low travel time on these projectiles could mean that your firing solution, as it's defined by your pipper there, would often be out of date by the time the projectiles get to where they're going. So I'm not sure that these would really be a good thing in PvP. I wouldn't bring them into PvP. Well, if you were going against larger vessels, yeah, or at least, you know what, if I was going up against vanguards in Arena Commander or freelancers, then yeah, you know what, I might bring things like this just to see what they can do. But if I was fighting M50s, not a chance in hell, you know. But being in a Sabre with, you know, a low observability ship, you would be able to pick your opponents, right? Because typically you would think that you would see them before they see you, so you would kind of be able to define the situation and say, am I going to go after this or am I not going to go after this? And I think that the Sabre overall is a ship that really lends itself to a specialist armament, because you really can pick and choose your battles. So you can say, hey, you know what, this situation looks really good for the loadout I got, this situation doesn't. So that's why I like these weapons, especially on the Sabre. It's just the Sabre allows you the freedom to choose, and I think that's one of the strongest things about the Sabre is, you know, so long as it does live up to its, you know, its reputation as being a stealth ship, and not just because it has typically lower emissions, but because it'll be harder to detect in the larger universe. I think that overall the Sabre will probably be a strong contender, especially with GT870s. Now, obviously not how we're using it here. I mean, we've already gone well over time of what we've used in the other weapon systems. With more practice, we could have done better. But clearly, for anti-fighter work, there are probably a lot better choices out there. But I would like to add that footnote that I think for fighting larger ships, I think these weapons would be pretty strong. But let's move on to the next weapon system. The Nightbridge Arms 11 Series Broadsword. Awesome. Absolutely awesome. Great rate of fire. Great ammo capacity, great stopping power. Just an awesome, awesome weapon system. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed these. And it seemed to have a very fast projectile travel. EM and thermal under control. Just amazing stopping power. Devastating weapon system. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. Even took this into PvP a little bit, and it worked beautifully. It was awesome. Absolutely awesome. Now, compared with the previous gun, the GT870, the Tarantula. Now, possibly these projectiles will cost less, much less, I don't know. Now, whether or not the larger projectiles in the Tarantula would have a much greater impact on larger vessels, it's possible. But one of the great things about these projectiles is they immediately go right through the shields and they start to work on the hull right away. Now, typically the armor of the hull is designed to resist projectile weapons, but supposedly you're going to be using energy weapons to kind of cut through the armor, whereas the shields stop energy weapons, yada yada yada, that whole rock paper scissors thing. But these weapons just go right through the shields and start dealing with the hull with authority. They are killers. They are absolute killers. And I cannot emphasize enough that with size 3 weapons, it really, really came down to the 11 series broadsword and the Panther. It was between those two guns automatically for all around work. These guns were amazing. I loved using them, and I just can't emphasize enough how great they are. I mean, they were absolutely not disappointments. If you've got the wreck, go out, get them, try them, love them. They're just amazing. Just absolutely devastating. I mean, I was able to just wreck a freelancer with these things. They were just so good. I mean, even, just in, squadron battles, I was able to sweep in and just absolutely wreck some people. Now, some people I had to fight a lot harder to get them down, just because, projectile damage is, I believe, lessened a little bit by having the shield still up. But there were times when I would just get the lucky shot in and it was just like, boom. And that's what I love about the projectile weapons, and these ones in particular. Now, the funny thing is like, I never ever looked at these weapons seriously. I always kind of looked at it and went, they don't really look all that badass, They don't look all that badass. But they really are. They really, really are. They are so good. I really, really enjoyed using them, and I cannot emphasize that enough, that if you go out and you grab a set of these and put them on any ship, really, I don't see how you could be disappointed with them. I wish there were more to fill out the line. I wish there was a set of size 2s so that I could put them, or at least size 2s that I could buy in the store, so that I could use them on gimbals, because I think size 2 versions of these with gimbals would be absolutely devastating. I mean, it would probably be the perfect marriage of these weapons if I could get those. But unfortunately, they're not in the store yet. Possibly, who knows, we might see the 10 series longsword or whatever they're going to call it in the future. I wish that some of the weapon systems were more fleshed out. I wish there were Omnisky 9s to test. I really, really do. But unfortunately, there are not. But these weapons they just seem to have that kind of perfect marriage of, the efficiency of energy weapons and the high travel speed of, energy weapon projectiles, married with just, that devastating projectile hitting power. It just really was perfect. And as you can see, I mean, we're getting right up here to what we did with the Panthers, and just awesome, absolutely awesome weapon system. Now, let's move on to something that was far less than awesome. Now, you remember with the last weapon system, I said, you know what, I didn't really give it a second look, and I didn't really take it seriously because I didn't think it looked all that badass. Well, here you got the Strife 2 mass drivers, and they look absolutely badass, and they've got a name, you know, Strife mass drivers. They're gimbaled size 2s. This is the first of the gimbaled size 2 weapons we're going to be testing, and, well, no. EM, one of the first things that you're going to notice, the EM emissions will sometimes spike when you're firing up to 1500 on these things. What? Accuracy, well, you'd think that something, you know, like a railgun basically would have, you know, a high-speed traveling projectile that would make it easy to tag targets. No. 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 You might be thinking, oh, you know what, you're being harsh, you're judging them, you know, you haven't had enough time to practice with them. I wouldn't practice with them. I wouldn't. I cannot tell you how much I reviled these guns. I just... It was just... It's... I'm sorry, but the way these guns are in the game right now, you might be thinking, oh, they might be good for assaulting. No. But they might be... No. But what about no? No. 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 F this. No. Alright, we need a palate cleanser here. Omnisky 6, baby. Yes! Or Omnisky V, if you know, if you're an idiot. Omnisky 6s. Reliable. Awesome. Completely trustworthy. You know what they're going to do. You know they're going to be awesome. I mean, you really don't have to sell Omniskys to anyone. There's a reason why these weapons have been nerfed. EM, a little bit spiky, a little bit up there, up in the 400s sometimes. Thermals, certainly with the overheats, it gets up there as well. It puts you up in SIG range of, say, like a Super Hornet. But you know what? After the last set of guns, who cares? Who the F cares? Now, you know, while I'm flying this ship, I also have, what is it, the Wen Cassell endo coolers on the ship, which are supposedly the most cooling coolers in the universe right now. And these things are still overheating like crazy. So, I mean, I get why CIG nerfed these guns, because they were awesome. Omniskys were absolutely awesome. And so CIG said, you know what, it's better to have a whole bunch of sort of things than to have one thing that is totally awesome. And, you know, who wants to really buff all the other things? I mean, honestly, these guns are really, really good. And even despite all the nerfs, I mean, look at them. They just murder shit. They just absolutely murder shit. And the fact that you don't have to worry about ammunition, yeah, these are wicked, wicked weapons. And I still love them. And even though I'm still guilty of taking out the Omnisky boat every now and again. You know, loading up my Super Hornet with Omniskys and just going hog wild. And you gotta love them. You just cannot love the Omniskys. Overheats, yeah, they do tend to suck, but man, when these suckers connect, they connect. They mess shit up, and they are just so good. I mean, projectile travel time, so good. Just, it's what it's supposed to be, man. I would love to see Omnisky 9s. I really, really would. Hint, hint. I just think they would be absolutely awesome. The fact that I've got these two coolers installed, and these are still overheating like crazy, and that's one of the things that I wanted to add into this video, The Cassell Endo Coolers J-Span Cryo Stars. I was gonna do a whole bit in this video about how these affect your thermal emissions and your EM emissions and so on and so forth. Yeah, they don't. No, they don't. In fact, I'm using all these weapons with the Cassell in, which is supposed to be the best, and I am not noticing a difference between having them and not having them. So maybe they're more of a reactive system that scales in over time, but you know what? They never really, if there was a difference, the difference is so minute. I mean, they were probably introduced so soft, just in case they were afraid that they would be overpowered or they would just cause people to go nuts with Omnisky boats again. I don't know. Maybe, it's sort of like the Vanguard. Like, they were so afraid to put the Vanguard in game that, the Vanguard came in a little bit soft and a little bit wimpy. And hopefully that gets worked out. But, yeah, the coolers never made much of a difference. And the only reason why I'm talking about all of these things over the Omniskys is because the Omniskys sell themselves. You cannot not know about the Omniskys. I mean, if you really don't know about Omniskys, then I mean, you really need to stop watching this video. You need to log in and you need to get to work, man. Omniskys are awesome, absolutely awesome, and they do live up to their reputation. They overheat like crazy, but they are absolutely devastating, and I love them. I mean, I would rate these just about as good as the Knightsbridge Arms guns if they didn't overheat as much. And I mean, that's even with a gimbal. Look at them. They're just cutting things down. They're awesome. Bearing Sawbucks. Well, you know what? You'd think that the Sawbucks would be amazing. You really would. But, well, Sawbucks are kind of a dud. They're not all that loud, they're not all that flashy. They're utterly forgettable, and so is their performance. Now, the EM and thermals on these, like the EM was fairly low. The thermal was a little bit warm, but really, I mean, typically with weapons, I mean, you want weapons that really just get the job done, and there's just some intangible quality to the Sawbucks that make them utterly boring to use. I mean, they were just, I mean, they're not terrible. It's just they're just so mediocre, It's I expected more. I really did. It's just that they were just like dot 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 dot. I'm sorry, man. It was just like I really don't know what to say about these weapons. Hitting things with them was a little bit tough because, once again, projectiles. But honestly, with all these weapons, I figured they're all pretty much in the same boat because I really haven't used a lot of these weapons, and some of them for a long, long time, and some of them at all. And so I figured that kind of put everything more or less in the same boat. But, I mean, the fact that I could go and I could take Knightsbridge Arms, and I could take those 11 series broadswords fixed and just crush it with them, and then come back to these things, and these things were just... they just didn't really show well for themselves. I just feel that there needs to be something more to these things. Like, maybe, like, instead of firing typical shells, like proximity grenades, it's sort of like a flak gun or something like that, would maybe be a little bit better, because, I mean, they are used for, the turret defenses right now on the Drake Cutlass and on the the Vanguard. And so possibly turning them into like little mini flat guns or something like that would make them a little bit more interesting. But as for right now, I mean, would I use these on a Sabre? No. No. These things are duds. Not all that interesting. Moving on. Now you might want to say, hey, I want to see the whole test. I want to see how they did. No, you don't. I've already shown you weapon systems that totally blow those out of the water, and those things were absolute. Well, they weren't trash, but you know, it was just like, honestly, having done all these tests and having used all these weapon systems, there's a lot better out there. So, speaking of which, let's get to a lot better. Now, next up, bearing M48 laser. Or laser. Now, these weapons are awesome. You kind of overlook them a lot because if you own a Super Hornet, you're always pulling them off to put on whatever to, you know, put on other Badgers, so you got all Badgers and you got all the same weapon on your ship. Or you're pulling them off to put on Omniskys, but you know what? You don't need to pull them off. The bearing M4s are awesome weapons. You know, where the Sawbuck is just boring, but in a bad way, the M4s are really boring, but in kind of a good way. You know, EM emissions can get a little bit highish, but thermals are very much under control. And that's often one of the bigger problems with weapons, is the frequent overheats that kind of, you know, that always hit at the worst possible time. But the truth is, the M4s, I mean, you have to work so hard to make these weapons overheat. It's just, I mean, it's almost impossible to do it. I mean, you would literally have to be firing at something way bigger than you to run, you know, to run these things overheated, something that had way more hit points than you could ever take down. They're efficient. I would say, even though they don't hit as hard as Omniskys, they're just as good as Omniskys, and they're frequently overlooked because of the fact that, you know, people kind of go, oh, well, you know, the Omniskys, I know the Omniskys and the M4s, it's always the weapon that I'm peeling off for this, that, or the other thing. And they don't really look all that exciting either, but you know what? They are absolutely awesome. Like, when I want to clear a Vandal Swarm for whatever reason, sometimes, you know, just to you know, while away some time, I will put M4s on my Super Hornet and, you know, little M3s on the little nose turret, and I love them. I love them to death. I think it's one of my favorite fittings for the Super Hornet. It's absolutely reliable. Overheats practically non-existent. They're excellent weapons. They're absolutely excellent weapons, and I really think that gimbaled, they go very, very well on this ship. Now, like I said, thermals, not that big of a deal, but EMs tend to run a little bit, just a touch hot. Not that much, but I mean, it does get up there at times. But overall, I just found them to be solid and reliable. And honestly, I am somewhat biased because these are one of my favorite weapons in the game. Just because of the fact that, you know, I like to shoot a lot. And, you know, sometimes my aim isn't the best, and just being able to just let her rip and not have to worry about overheating, it's just one of the things that helps keep combat as simple as possible. It's just, whoa. It's just one of those things that, you know, you don't have to worry about as much. It's just one of those things that you can kind of, one of those thoughts that you can push out of your head and concentrate more on the situation as it's, you know, as it's unfolding before you. And that's one of the things, it's one of those little intangible qualities, but it's, I think, a very important quality when dealing with these weapons, is the fact is that you can just forget about the whole overheat thing. They just do solid work. And as you can see, I mean, I've already pushed it up to wave 3 here at 3 minutes in. I mean, great weapons, absolutely fantastic weapons. Now, I wanted to try the M5A lasers for this video, but unfortunately you can't buy them on the market, but they do come with the Xeon Scout. But I wasn't going to go out and buy another Xeon Scout just so I could, have a full set of M5As to test on this. Though hopefully when they do end up in the store, I'll come back and take a look at those, because I really have a feeling, I want to see how they are fixed, because gimbaled they're awesome in the M4As, but I would really like to see what these weapons are like in a fixed mounting one size up. There is one other consideration though when you're dealing with the M4As, is the M4As do typically hit for quite a bit of damage, but their range is not the greatest, so these weapons are more for close-in work. But if you're using the ship to kind of sneak up on people and get real close to them, depending on, how the stealth mechanics work out towards the final version of the game, these might be a weapon system to be considered. Now, obviously, something with a much, much higher alpha, if you can get in close enough, might be considered good, but you never know how that situation is going to turn out if they're going to start moving on you, and you might need gimbaled weapons, or you might need something that you can fire a lot and not have to worry about the thermal on it. And I think that these are very solid weapons, and I would recommend at least getting them for rec and trying them out. Once we can get the M5As, I think that those will be equally as good in the fixed setting, but once again, we gotta wait and see for those. Anyways, overall, M4As definitely worth it, and definitely one of the stronger weapon systems that I would consider out of all the ones that I've tested. They definitely had a very strong showing. Badgers. Now, Badgers are basically Star Citizen's version of death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, these weapons are just absolute saturation. It's spray and pray, but you don't have to worry about ammunition, because they're laser weapons, they're energy weapons, they're not projectile weapons. So you can just let her rip and just tear them apart, and I like them. I wish they hit a little bit harder, but I think that would make them a little bit overpowered. Now, EM emissions, definitely up there. Thermals, not so much. Actually, very, very, very easy on the thermals. Now, of course, with the coolers on, I mean, they really don't seem to be doing much, but the Badgers don't really seem to overheat as much as they used to. They're a lot easier on that, and that's one of the great things about them, is because they don't typically hit for as much per shot. You really need to saturate your target with them, and that's kind of one of the great things about them. Is in the current build, the Badgers are still a very good weapon. Not, in my mind, typically the best weapon, but I really think that these are very strong weapons. And certainly, I mean, if you're sneaking up on somebody and all of a sudden it turns into a bit of a knife fight with the Badgers, it depends, because in PvP, obviously they've got a lot more hit points than the NPCs do here, so the damage from the Badgers might not quite be enough, and that's kind of why I prefer the M4As over them. But there is something to be said for the saturation effect, and I mean, going beyond that, just how that messes with someone's psychology or just their state of mind when they're under constant bombardment, and they're constantly getting hits, and they're constantly seeing their shields flicker, or seeing weapon systems being listed as damaged, or going from green to yellow to red. I mean, there's something to be said for that, and the Badgers, I think, still have a strong role to play in the game. And I think individual players obviously could make a very strong case for these weapon systems. People who play with them who are a lot more accurate than I am. But I really think that they are decent weapons. I mean, the fact that you already come with 2 of them on your Sabre, putting on 2 more, whoa, okay. That was pretty slick, I have to admit. But, yeah, the fact that you only have to put on 2 more and they're not exactly expensive weapons, I think makes them pretty strong and something definitely worth exploring, especially if you're aiming more towards a PvE type existence in the game. I really, really like the Badgers. Range, not the greatest, but not the worst by far. But overall, I mean, it depends on what suits your style the most. And I mean, if you're really just looking for something that can do the job and you don't have to worry about ammunition and those expenses, and something that will just chew up enemies, especially like NPC enemies, then I think if that is the specific existence that you're going for, then a set of gimbaled Badgers isn't a bad idea on a Sabre. For PvP, I would strongly not recommend it, but for just regular NPCing, for regular PvE, I don't really think that they'll ever be a detriment to you. Except maybe if you're going up against much larger ships, like say like a Connie, or something bigger than that, like a mining ship, like an Orion, or if you're trying to take down a Reclaimer. I think you would go with one of the heavier weapons like the GT870s. This weapon I think is more purely for fighter work or very small ship work. I don't really think it's going to compete against much larger vessels, but for strictly fighter to fighter and for NPCing, I really strongly like the Badgers for that type of work. Anyways, now we have been through an enormous amount of weapon systems, and then now I'm looking at the timer, I'm realizing just how long this video is, and there are some other weapon systems that I'm just going to kind of horn in on the Badger's time here, but everybody knows the Badger. I mean, it comes with the Hornet. Everyone's used it. I wasn't able to get myself a set of Sledge 2s. I ran out of wreck, and I wasn't going to go out and start spending real money on it. I ran out of wreck before I could get to the Sledge 2s, but I do typically like the Sledge 2s very much, and I would like to explore that at a later date as a possible sniper fitting. But with the slow travel time of projectiles, I'm a little bit leery right now, but against a larger vessel, because they specifically advertise a low sig for the ship, I think that Sledge 2s will be strong, but I want to use them against larger ships, and I want to produce a test against larger ships in the future anyway. So that's going to be something I'm going to do down the road. But overall, of all the weapon systems that I used, really the standouts were for me the Panthers, the Broadswords, and the M4A lasers. Those were, I think, M4A lasers on gimbals, and for fixed, either Panther or Broadsword. I think those were the three strongest candidates, the three that I thought would have the most overall use in as many different applications as you could think of, and were, in my experience, the most reliable to use. So with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and end this video here. I want to spend more time talking about tactics and things like that, but as I realize, as I'm looking at the timer, and we are closing in on about an hour, and I still have to render this and then upload it, I'm gonna have to save that for another time. And obviously I want to have a chance to explore the universe a little bit more and see what's going on and what people are doing out there, and then just trying to use the Sabre to maybe sneak up on some people out in the baby PU and see just what I can pull off. But I think that altogether is a different video. This video will just cover up basic weapons, and we will end the video here. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. It certainly took a while to create, and thanks for watching.
Quantum travel initiated.